is still, the air soft with the kind of quiet that makes you lean back, close your eyes, and let the world slow to a gentle hum. Tonight, I will tell you a story, not just a story about money or lessons or even success, but a story of two fathers, two paths, and the quiet truths that live in the space between them. One was a man of education and steady work, believing in the safety of a paycheck, the prestige of a good job, and the honor of climbing life's respectable ladder. His was a world of stability, of doing things the right way. The other was a man who played a different game. He spoke in the language of assets, opportunities, and the subtle art of making money work for you, instead of the other way around. His world was not one of certainties, but of possibilities. In between these two men was a boy, young Robert Kiyosaki, who listened, learned, and began to see the strange and beautiful dance between comfort and courage, between tradition and boldness. His journey is not just about the lessons of wealth, but about the choices that shape the course of a life. This is not a lecture, nor a business seminar. This is a journey back through time, into the dusty streets of Hawaii, where young Robert grew up, into quiet kitchen conversations that shaped his understanding of the world, and into the long nights when the mind cannot help but wander, imagining what could be if one dared to think differently. I will guide you through it slowly, as though walking a long and winding path under the moonlight. We will stop at moments of decision, glance into the faces of those who shaped the boy, and hear the echoes of two very different philosophies whispering in his ears. Before we begin, take a deep breath. Let the noise of the day fade into the background. And tell me, from where in the world are you listening tonight? Is the moon high above your window, or is the sun just beginning to touch the edge of your horizon? What hour finds you here, leaning into this story with me? Settle in. Let the night carry you. Hello, my name is Sherry, and welcome to my channel. So let's begin. The island air of Hawaii in the 1950s carried a certain softness, a gentle scent of plumeria drifting in from the trees, mingling with the salt spray of the Pacific. For a young boy named Robert Kiyosaki, the island was more than just a place on a map. It was a tapestry of colors, smells, and textures, but also of ideas. And in that tapestry, two threads would soon be woven so differently that they would change the very way he understood life. Robert's childhood was not marked by poverty, nor by great riches. His home was modest, but filled with warmth, the hum of a small community, and the slow rhythm of days shaped by school, play, and the occasional call of the ocean waves. Yet even in these seemingly simple surroundings, there was a quiet divide, not of land or family, but of philosophy. Two father figures stood in his world. Both loved him, both were intelligent, and both believed they knew the path to success. But the paths they walked could not have been more different. One of them was his real father, the man who had raised him from birth. Educated, disciplined, and deeply rooted in the belief that education was the great equalizer. He worked in the public school system and valued the security of a stable paycheck. He believed in climbing the ladder through dedication and good credentials. To him, the road to a good life was straight and narrow. Study hard, get into a respected institution, work diligently for decades, and retire with dignity. There was safety in such a road. There was honor in it. The other man was not related to Robert by blood, but in time, his influence would be just as deep. This was the father of Robert's best friend, a man of few formal degrees, but of sharp instincts in business. His mind worked differently, not in the linear march of salary raises and promotions, but in the looping, circling way of investments, assets, and leverage. He saw money not as something to be earned once and spent, but as something that could be set into motion, a river that could carry you if you learned how to guide it. At first, Robert could not reconcile these two voices. His real father spoke of the importance of a good, steady job with benefits, of saving diligently and living modestly. His friend's father spoke of building businesses, taking calculated risks, and making money work harder than any person ever could. The young boy, barely in his early years, found himself caught between these two visions of the future. Life in Hawaii gave him a front row seat to both ways of thinking. His real father would leave for work each morning in neatly pressed clothes, carrying the weight of responsibility that came with managing in the education system. His desk at home was filled with books on history, literature, and the philosophies of great thinkers. He admired people who had titles, letters after their names, and long resumes. His other father, the rich dad, as Robert would later call him, had a desk too. But instead of books on literature, it was littered with ledgers, contracts, and property maps. His day might begin with a meeting at a small storefront he owned, followed by a drive to inspect a rental property, then a quick lunch where the talk was less about current events and more about market trends. His wealth wasn't flashy, but it was visible in subtle ways. The quiet confidence in his posture, the freedom to decide how to spend his time, the lack of worry in his brow. Robert, young as he was, began to notice these differences, not as judgments, but as observations. It was as though he had been given two lenses through which to see the world. One lens was clear and orderly, showing a life of predictable steps and rewards. The other lens was less structured, but opened into a wider horizon, where the possibility of both great gain and great loss danced together. It was during those early years that Robert's curiosity began to take root. He started asking questions, not the kind a child usually asks, but deeper ones. Why does one person seem to have more choices than another? Why does one work hard for money, while another seems to make money without working as much? His real father would answer in one way: education is the key. Without it, you'll always be limited. Get good grades, and you'll always find work. His rich dad would answer differently: Education is important, but not the kind they teach in school. Learn how money works, and you'll never be at its mercy. It was confusing at times. At school, Robert would learn about history and math, about reading and science. At home, he was learning about budgets, the difference between an asset and a liability. Even if he didn't fully understand the terms yet, and the way people's fears and desires influenced their choices, Hawaii itself seemed to reflect this duality. The islands were a place where tradition lived alongside change. Ancient Hawaiian customs and community values coexisted with modern businesses and global trade. Tourists arrived with pockets full of money, while many locals worked long hours in hotels or plantations just to keep their families afloat. Robert could see, even then, that the world was not equal, not in opportunity, not in outcomes. The contrast between his two fathers became sharper with each passing year. When Robert expressed a desire for something, a new bicycle, perhaps, his real father might suggest saving allowance money over many months. His rich dad might ask, "How could you buy it without using your own money?" And then challenge Robert to think of ways to create income. These weren't just lessons about things, they were lessons about thinking itself. His rich dad believed that wealth started in the mind, in the way you framed problems and spotted solutions others overlooked. His real father believed wealth was the byproduct of diligence and responsibility. By the time Robert reached his preteen years, he had begun working small jobs, but not in the way most kids did. For his rich dad, the point wasn't the wage, it was the learning. Robert might be asked to help in a store, not so he could earn a few dollars, but so he could watch how customers behaved, how goods were priced, how small efficiencies added up over time. His real father found this unusual, even a little troubling. But Robert felt a quiet excitement. It was as though there was a secret set of rules for money, and he was just beginning to glimpse them. In those early nights, lying in bed with the sound of the ocean outside, Robert's mind would drift between these two worlds. One offered the comfort of a clear path, the other the thrill of uncharted waters. He did not yet know which one he would choose, but he could feel the pull of both. And somewhere in the distance, though he could not yet name it, was the first flicker of a truth that would guide his life. Sometimes, the most important education is the one you seek outside the classroom. The boy had begun his journey, but he had no idea how far it would take him, nor that soon a simple question about money would open the door to his first great lesson. The days on the island rolled forward with their easy rhythm, the hum of cicadas in the afternoon heat, the laughter of children spilling out of the schoolyard, the deep orange sunsets that seemed to stretch time itself. But in young Robert's world, something subtle had shifted. The contrast between his two fathers had gone from a quiet observation to a question that refused to leave him alone. It began, as many important things do, with a moment so small might have gone unnoticed. Robert and his friend Mike had been talking one Saturday morning, sitting on the curb outside Mike's house. They were both around 9 years old, their knees dusty from playing, their imaginations full of schemes. Robert had been saving coins in an old jar for weeks, but when he rattled them in his palm, they felt insignificant. He had done the math. It would take months to buy the bike he wanted. The slowness of the process frustrated him. It was then that Mike, almost casually, said, "Maybe we could make money instead of just saving it." The thought lingered in the air between them. Children weren't supposed to think like that. They earned allowance, they saved, they spent. But Robert remembered the way Mike's father, the man he was coming to think of as Rich Dad, had once said, "Don't work for money, make money work for you." It was a phrase that sounded like a riddle, one Robert had yet to solve. The two boys decided to approach Rich Dad with their question. The man listened quietly, leaning back in his chair. His eyes didn't immediately light up with answers. Instead, he asked them questions. Why do you want more money? What would you do with it? And why should you be paid more than someone else? Robert was slightly taken aback. His real father would have probably answered with encouragement about working harder or finding a safe job to earn more. But Rich Dad was not in the business of giving simple instructions. He wanted them to think. Finally, he said, "If you really want to learn how to make money, I can teach you. But it won't be the way they teach you in school. It won't be easy, and you might not like it at first." Robert felt a flicker of excitement and a touch of doubt. What could be harder than just working for a paycheck? But curiosity won. Both boys agreed. The following week, Rich Dad put them to work in one of his small stores. It was a humble place, nothing grand, just a simple business with shelves stocked with goods, the bell above the door jingling whenever a customer entered. Robert's job was basic: unpack boxes, stock shelves, sweep the floor. For this, he would earn 10 cents an hour. It was a meager sum, even for a child in those days. But Robert didn't complain, not yet. 3 weeks passed. The work was repetitive, the hours long for boys their age, and the pay barely enough to buy a small treat. Robert began to feel cheated. He considered quitting. The lessons his real father had taught him echoed in his mind. If you work hard and prove yourself, you should be rewarded. But here, the harder he worked, the more it seemed the reward stayed the same. Finally, he confronted Rich Dad. "You're not paying me enough," Robert said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's not fair." The man studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Good. You're beginning to feel what most people feel their whole lives, that they are working harder and harder for less and less. You're feeling what I wanted you to feel, because until you feel it, you won't understand why you must learn something different." Robert frowned. "Different how?" Rich Dad leaned forward. "The poor and the middle class work for money. The rich make money work for them. Most people spend their lives trading their time for money, never realizing they can create systems investments, or businesses that earn for them even when they sleep. You felt frustrated because you were focusing only on the paycheck. That's what keeps people trapped. It was a seed planted deep in Robert's mind. The lesson wasn't in the 10 cents per hour. It was in the discomfort, the realization that simply working more or harder was not the path to freedom. If he wanted a different outcome, he would have to learn to think differently. The next stage of the lesson was stranger still. Rich Dad stopped paying them altogether. From now on, he said, you'll work for free. Robert's jaw nearly dropped. Work for nothing? What kind of lesson was that? His real father would never have agreed to such a thing. But Rich Dad was deliberate. Without the expectation of a paycheck, he explained, they might begin to see opportunities others overlooked. They might start thinking about how the store could be run better, how customers could be served differently, how value could be created in ways that didn't depend on a wage. For the first time, Robert began to notice things he hadn't before. How customers gravitated towards certain products, how some items stayed on the shelves too long, how the store's small advertising signs caught attention or didn't. The moment money was removed from the equation, his attention shifted from the hours he worked to the patterns that created profit. Then came the turning point. On a quiet afternoon, Robert saw the old comic books stacked in a corner. They were slightly damaged, unsellable at full price, and the shop owner didn't bother with them. Robert asked if he could take them. The answer was yes. That evening, he and Mike set up a small reading room in Mike's basement, charging neighborhood kids a small fee to come in and read as many comics as they liked for a set period of time. The idea caught on quickly. In a single week, the little enterprise made more money than Robert would have earned working at the store. It wasn't about the comics. It was about the shift in thinking. Robert had taken something overlooked, something others saw as worthless, and turned it into value. Rich Dad's point was beginning to take shape. Opportunity isn't always in plain sight, and money comes to those who learn to recognize it. At home, his real father listened to the story with a mixture of pride and caution. He was glad Robert was learning initiative, but still believed education and a steady career were the safest route. Business can be risky, he warned. Not everyone succeeds. Robert didn't disagree, but somewhere inside, he felt the pull of the other path, the one where you create something, where you choose the terms. It was still foreign, still uncertain, but it carried a spark of freedom that the safer road did not. From that day on, Robert no longer saw money as just coins in a jar or a number on a paycheck. He began to see it as a current, something that could flow through many channels, some narrow, some wide, and that the true skill was in shaping those channels. And more importantly, he understood that the first lesson wasn't about getting rich at all. It was about escaping the trap that so many never even realize they're in. The boys had taken their first steps. The path ahead would twist and climb, but the door was open now, and there was no going back. The lesson of the comic books lingered in Robert's mind like the aftertaste of something sweet, not overpowering, but impossible to forget. He had tasted the small thrill of creating income without depending on an hourly wage. And once that door was cracked open, it was hard to close. Still, Rich Dad was quick to remind him. The point was not the profit itself, it was the thinking behind it. And now, it was time for the next truth, one that would quietly challenge the very foundation of how most people lived their lives. It came on an afternoon when the trade winds swept in from the ocean, rustling the palm fronds outside Rich Dad's small office. Robert had come in expecting perhaps another task at the store, or maybe even a new small venture like the comic book idea. But Rich Dad simply sat across from him, hands folded, his eyes steady. "You've learned that working for money is a trap," he began. "But there's something more dangerous than the trap itself, and that's believing that escaping it is just about making more money. It's not. It's about learning." Robert frowned slightly. "Learning what?" "Learning everything you can," Rich Dad said, his voice calm but deliberate. "Most people spend their lives becoming very good at one thing. They're specialists. They can do one job well, maybe they're a teacher, or a mechanic, or an accountant, and that's all they know. It makes them dependent. If that one thing is taken from them, they're lost. The rich, on the other hand, learn across fields. They study money, yes, but also marketing, management, sales, investing. They work not for a paycheck, but for skills. Every skill is a tool in your box. The more tools you have, the more problems you can solve, and solving problems is how wealth is made." It was a perspective that felt, to Robert, both empowering and overwhelming. He had been taught, as most children are, that the goal of work was to earn money, and that education in school was the main place you learned. Rich Dad was flipping that upside down. Work, in his view, was not the destination, but the classroom. To prove his point, Rich Dad gave Robert and Mike an unusual challenge. "I want you to take a job you know nothing about," he said. "Something outside your comfort zone. Don't worry about the pay. Worry about what it will teach you." So, the boys found themselves helping out at another one of Rich Dad's businesses, a small cafe that served breakfast and lunch to the locals. It was not glamorous work. They cleared tables, wiped counters, and occasionally delivered food to customers. But in the process, they watched how the cafe was run, how the manager handled the morning rush, how suppliers were negotiated with, how cash was counted and recorded at the end of the day. They saw, in a living example, that a business was more than just the service or product it sold. It was a constant flow of decisions, large and small. When a shipment of eggs arrived slightly damaged, Robert watched the manager decide whether to accept them at a discount or send them back. When a tourist complained about slow service, the manager offered a free coffee to keep goodwill intact. These were tiny adjustments in the moment, but together they shaped the cafe's success. Robert realized that none of these decisions had anything to do with cooking food, the supposed skill of a cafe. They were about relationships, negotiation, customer care, and adaptability. And yet, they were skills that could be carried into any business, in any industry. After a few weeks, Rich Dad met with them again. "So," he asked, "what did you learn?" Robert began listing the practical things: how inventory was tracked, how pricing was adjusted based on ingredient costs. But Rich Dad shook his head. "No, what did you really learn?" Robert hesitated, then said, "That the cafe isn't just about food. It's about managing people, solving problems, and keeping money flowing." Rich Dad smiled. "Exactly. And those are skills you can use anywhere. You could run a cafe, a store, a hotel, or a factory. The principles are the same. That's why you work for learning, not for money." It was a simple sentence, but it settled into Robert like a stone into still water, sending quiet ripples through his thoughts. He began to see how many adults he knew were trapped not by a lack of work, but by the narrowness of their skills. His real father, for example, was an excellent educator, respected and trusted, but outside of the education system, his skills were harder to monetize. If the school system failed him, he would have no backup plan. The idea of learning broadly, of deliberately seeking out skills instead of paychecks, began to feel like a kind of insurance against uncertainty. And Robert began to notice that Rich Dad himself often worked in ways that didn't produce immediate cash. He would attend community events, meet with other business owners, or learn about industries he wasn't yet involved in. Sometimes he even took on roles that, on paper, looked like a waste of time. But later, those connections or bits of knowledge would open doors. One afternoon, Robert asked him about this. "Why spend time on something if it doesn't make you money right away?" Rich Dad leaned back in his chair. "Because money is the result, not the cause. Knowledge, relationships, and experience are the causes. Money follows them, not the other way around." Most people get that backwards. This was a deeply different way of thinking than what Robert saw in most adults' lives. At school, children were already being asked, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" As though the choice was permanent, as though one path defined you forever. But Rich Dad encouraged the opposite. Explore, adapt, keep learning. In the months that followed, Robert and Mike rotated through other small roles in Rich Dad's network of businesses: a warehouse, a rental property, even helping with basic bookkeeping in an office. Each place taught something new. In the warehouse, Robert learned the importance of logistics, how delays in one area ripple through an entire system. In property management, he saw how maintenance costs and tenant relationships could make or break profitability. In the office, he learned that keeping records wasn't just a chore, it was the map by which a business navigated. Slowly, Robert's view of work began to transform. No longer was it simply a trade of hours for dollars. It was a vast, living classroom, and each skill he picked up was a tool that could be carried forward, ready for the day when he would build something of his own. By the time he was a teenager, he had already begun to think in terms of versatility rather than specialization. He didn't want to be tied to one role, one paycheck, one fragile stream of income. He wanted a wide net of abilities that could be cast into many waters. And though he still valued what he learned in school, he began to understand its limits, that the real world operated by rules that were often invisible to those who never looked beyond the walls of a classroom. Rich Dad's voice echoed in his mind. Work for learning, not for money. It was a lesson that would serve him long after those early days in Hawaii, and one that, perhaps without realizing it, was already shaping the man he would become. But learning was only the first step. Soon, Rich Dad would introduce him to a concept that would change how he saw every purchase, every expense, every possession, forever. By the time Robert was old enough to work more independently, he had already gathered a scattered but growing collection of lessons from Rich Dad. The value of learning over wages, the importance of varied skills, the danger of being trapped in a single role. But one afternoon, in the quiet back room of a small office, Rich Dad introduced a truth so simple and yet so often ignored that it would become the very backbone of Robert's financial philosophy. The conversation began not with charts or numbers, but with a question. Robert, Rich Dad said, resting his elbows on the desk, do you know the difference between an asset and a liability? Robert hesitated. He thought he did. An asset is something you own, like a house or a car. And a liability is a debt. Rich Dad's eyes crinkled at the corners, the faintest hint of a smile forming. That's what most people think, and that's why most people struggle financially their whole lives. Let me show you something different. He pulled out a piece of paper and drew two simple columns. At the top of one, he wrote assets. At the top of the other, liabilities. Beneath assets, he wrote, puts money in your pocket. Beneath liabilities, he wrote, takes money out of your pocket. That's it, he said, tapping the paper with his pen. That's the real definition. Forget the fancy accounting terms. If it gives you money, it's an asset. If it costs you money, it's a liability. And the game of wealth is simply this: buy assets, reduce liabilities. Robert leaned forward, studying the paper. It seemed almost too simple. Yet, as Rich Dad began to give examples, the simplicity sharpened into something profound. Your home, Rich Dad said, is not an asset, not unless it earns you money. Most people think it is, because it has value. But if every month you're paying a mortgage, paying for repairs, paying property taxes, that house is taking money out of your pocket. That makes it a liability. Now, if you own a rental property and someone else is paying you rent that covers the expenses and leaves you a profit, That's an asset. Robert felt a quiet shock move through him. He thought of his own family's home, proud, well-kept, and expensive. His real father often spoke of it as their greatest investment. But in Rich Dad's terms, it was not paying them, it was draining them. And a car, Rich Dad continued. A car is almost always a liability. It loses value the moment you drive it off the lot. It costs you fuel, insurance, maintenance. The only time it could be considered an asset is if it's making you more money than it costs. Like if you use it for a profitable delivery business. Robert began to see how the definitions of asset and liability were not just about objects. They were about perspective. People's financial lives were often shaped by illusions. They called something an investment because it was valuable on paper, not because it produced income. They told themselves they were building wealth, when in reality, they were building a collection of expensive obligations. So, Rich Dad said, if you want to be rich, you don't focus on your income first. You focus on how many assets you own. Assets feed you. Liabilities bleed you. To drive the point home, he drew a small diagram, a simple cash flow chart. For the poor, the flow went like this. They earned money, spent it on expenses, and had nothing left. For the middle class, they earned money, bought liabilities, like bigger houses or nicer cars, and those liabilities created more expenses. For the rich, they earned money and used it to buy assets, which in turn produced more income, which they used to buy more assets. It was a cycle, but a very different one. Robert could feel the weight of the lesson settling in. He thought of how many people he knew, neighbors, relatives, worked tirelessly to afford the trappings of success. The large home, the shiny new car, the expensive vacations, yet they often complained about bills, about debt, about not having enough left over. They were, unknowingly, feeding liabilities while starving assets. Rich Dad leaned back. The trick is to start early, even small. You don't need to buy a skyscraper or a company. You can start with something as simple as stocks, bonds, a small piece of real estate, a business idea. The important thing is that it puts money in your pocket without you having to be there every minute. In the weeks that followed, Robert began to look at the world differently. He walked through his neighborhood and mentally labeled what he saw. Asset, liability, liability, asset. He noticed that many families with the appearance of wealth were surrounded by liabilities, possessions that cost them money every day. Meanwhile, some of the quieter, less flashy households belonged to people quietly building assets, investing in things that didn't shout their value, but quietly grew it. One weekend, Rich Dad took Robert and Mike to see one of his small rental properties. It wasn't impressive at first glance, just a modest building with a few apartments. But Rich Dad pointed to it with the satisfaction of a farmer showing off a fertile field. Every month, he said, this building pays me. The tenant's rent covers the mortgage, maintenance, taxes, and still leaves me a profit. And over time, The property itself will increase in value. That's an asset. Standing there, Robert felt the concept solidify. An asset wasn't about pride of ownership. It wasn't about status. It was about cash flow, the quiet, consistent flow of money toward you rather than away from you. His real father, when Robert tried to explain the concept, didn't quite agree. He acknowledged the value of investing, but insisted that a good home was still an investment in one's future. It's stability, he said. It's security for your family. Robert didn't argue. He understood now that security could mean different things to different people. For his real father, security was a steady job and a well-kept home. For Rich Dad, security was having enough assets that no single job or source of income could threaten your stability. Over time, Robert began keeping his own little balance sheet in a notebook, 2 columns, assets and liabilities. At first, there wasn't much in the asset column, but the act of tracking it made him conscious of every choice. If he wanted something, he asked himself, will this put money in my pocket or take it out? It became a quiet filter through which every purchase passed. Rich Dad's words stayed with him. The poor and middle class buy liabilities they think are assets. The rich acquire assets that others overlook. And the earlier you start, the faster you escape the trap. The boy who had once rattled coins in a jar, impatient for a bike, now found himself thinking in terms of streams of income, of cash flow, of building something that would feed him even while he slept. And though he didn't yet realize it, this simple shift, this redefinition of assets and liabilities, was the foundation on which every future lesson would stand. The world was full of money, Rich Dad had said. The question was whether it was flowing toward you or away from you. And soon, Robert would learn that even the words we use about money can decide which way that current runs. The lesson of assets and liabilities had given Robert a new pair of eyes. He no longer looked at possessions in the same way. Cars, houses, even hobbies, all of them, he now understood, were either quietly feeding him or quietly draining him. But Rich Dad wasn't finished. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the Hawaiian hills, and the air grew thick with the smell of frangipani, Rich Dad invited Robert and Mike into his study. The room was small but full of presents. Walls lined with books, ledgers stacked neatly on a side table, and an old wooden desk that had seen decades of deals. Rich Dad leaned back in his chair, his voice slow and deliberate. Now that you understand the difference between an asset and a liability, he said, it's time to learn something most people never think about: the language of money. Robert tilted his head. The language of money? Yes, Rich Dad said, because money, like any subject, has its own vocabulary. And if you don't know the words, you can't understand the game. Worse, you can't even tell when you're losing. It was a concept that made immediate sense to Robert. He thought of school, how you couldn't do well in history unless you knew the names of places and events. or how you couldn't solve a math problem if you didn't understand terms like denominator or coefficient. But here was a subject everyone needed for survival, and yet few knew its words. Rich Dad took out a sheet of paper and wrote a list: asset, liability, cash flow, income statement, balance sheet, capital gain, passive income, ROI. These, he said, tapping the paper, are just the start. If you know these terms and truly understand them, you will already be ahead of most people. But the important thing is not to memorize them like school definitions. It's to see how they live in the real world. Robert nodded, his eyes scanning the words. Some he recognized, others were foreign. But as Rich Dad began to explain, the terms took on a kind of weight. Cash flow, for example, was no longer just money coming in and out. It was the bloodstream of a business or household, the pattern of how resources moved. If the flow was steady and positive, you were strong. If it was negative, you were bleeding out, even if you had assets on paper. ROI, return on investment, was not just a number, but a question. Am I getting back more than I put in? It applied not only to money, but to time, to energy, to relationships. Rich Dad smiled when he explained this. People forget, he said, that time is also an investment. You can waste it just as easily as you can waste money. Robert began to realize that this vocabulary was more than jargon. It was a way of thinking. When someone said they were broke, most people heard no money. But Rich Dad would ask, what's your cash flow? What assets are producing income? What liabilities are draining you? To him, broke was often a temporary condition, a snapshot in time, but poor was a mindset, revealed in the words people used. It struck Robert how powerful this was. Words shape thought. Thought shapes decisions. Decisions shape reality. If you didn't even have the words to describe your financial situation accurately, you couldn't hope to improve it. Rich Dad shared a story. Years ago, a friend of his had bought a small piece of land. On paper, the land had value, but it wasn't producing any income. This friend insisted it was his biggest asset. When a financial crunch came, he was forced to sell it at a loss. If he had understood cash flow, Rich Dad said, he would have realized it was actually a liability for him, at least until he developed it or leased it. But he didn't have the words, so he didn't have the clarity. Robert thought of his real father. He had a large vocabulary in literature, politics, and education. Words that could illuminate ideas, inspire students, and win debates. But when it came to money, the words were fewer, the concepts less precise. This wasn't because he lacked intelligence. It was because the subject had never been taught to him in a structured way. And that was the quiet tragedy Rich Dad saw everywhere. Intelligent, capable people trapped not by lack of effort, but by lack of the right vocabulary. To drive the lesson home, Rich Dad gave Robert and Mike an exercise. For the next month, he said, I want you to write down every financial word you hear from the newspaper, from conversations, from the radio, and then find out what it means. Don't just copy a dictionary definition. Ask me, ask someone who uses it every day, or see how it works in real life. At first, the boys stumbled through the task. They wrote down terms like dividend, equity, overhead, and capital. Some seemed abstract, almost like a foreign language, but as they gathered more examples, patterns emerged. The words weren't random. They were the tools of those who worked with money intentionally. One evening, Robert came across the term leveraging. He asked Rich Dad about it, and the explanation lit a spark in his mind. Leverage, Rich Dad said, is using borrowed resources, money, skills, time, to increase the return on your own. It's how you can control more than you own. Used wisely, it accelerates wealth. Used foolishly, it destroys it. It was as if Robert had been given a new color to paint with. He began to see leverage everywhere. In the way a business owner hired skilled staff, in how a landlord used a mortgage to control property that would pay for itself, even in how a cafe bought supplies on credit to serve customers before paying the bill. As the weeks passed, Robert noticed something else. The more words he learned, the more invisible doors began to appear in his mind. Conversations that had once washed over him now made sense. Newspaper articles that seemed dull now revealed opportunities. And with each new term, the world of money became less mysterious, less intimidating. Rich Dad was pleased, but he added a warning. Knowing the words isn't enough. You must be able to use them to ask the right questions. A doctor who knows medical terms but can't diagnose is useless. In money, the ability to diagnose a situation, to look at numbers, trends, and patterns, is what gives you power. It was another layer to the lesson. Vocabulary was not just knowledge, it was a tool for analysis. And without analysis, even the most educated person could still make foolish decisions. One night, lying in bed, Robert thought about the strange gap between his two fathers. His real father's vocabulary belonged to the world of employment, academia, and policy. Rich Dad's vocabulary belonged to the world of ownership, enterprise, and investment. The words were different because the worlds were different, and Robert knew which world he wanted to inhabit. The truth settled in quietly. Before you can change your financial life, you must first change the language you use to describe it. And soon, Robert would hear a phrase from Rich Dad that would put all these words into motion. A phrase that described the endless cycle most people live in without even realizing it. The rat race, the lessons on assets, liabilities, and financial vocabulary had begun to reshape the way Robert saw the world. Yet, there was one more truth that Rich Dad said most people never confronted, not because it was hidden, but because it was so familiar they stopped noticing it. It was a late Saturday morning. The air was heavy with the scent of the ocean, and the streets hummed with a mix of locals running errands and tourists moving from shop to shop. Robert and Mike sat across from Rich Dad in a small diner. The clink of silverware and the low murmur of conversations filled the background. Rich Dad stirred his coffee slowly before speaking. "Do you know what most people spend their lives doing?" he asked. Robert shrugged. "Working?" "Yes," Rich Dad said, "but more than that. They spend their lives running in circles, chasing money to pay for things, and then working more to pay for the new things they bought. They do it over and over again until the years slip by. I call it the rat race." The words landed with a curious weight. Robert pictured a small wheel inside a cage, a mouse running endlessly, never getting anywhere. It was a simple image, but it unsettled him. Rich Dad continued, "Most people start young. They go to school, they learn how to be good employees, and then they get a job. Their first paycheck feels like freedom. But soon, bills arrive, rent, utilities, maybe a car payment. Then they want nicer things, so they work harder or get a better paying job. But with the higher income comes higher expenses, a bigger home, better clothes, dinners out. They think they're moving up, but the wheel is just spinning faster." Robert thought of neighbors he'd seen, families upgrading their homes, buying new cars, yet always speaking about how tight money was. He remembered overhearing adults joke about living paycheck to paycheck, though their lives didn't seem poor. "Why don't they just stop?" Robert asked. "Because fear and desire keep the wheel spinning," Rich Dad said, leaning in slightly. "Fear of not having enough, fear of losing what they have, and desire for more. When they earn more, they think they can spend more. When they spend more, they need to earn even more to keep up, and the wheel turns." It was a cycle Robert had seen, but never named. His real father, though wise in many areas, was also caught in it, working hard to maintain a good home, pay for education, save for retirement. There was nothing wrong with it, but Robert could now see the trap. The security it promised was always just out of reach. Rich Dad tapped the table for emphasis. "The only way out is to break the pattern. You do that by building assets that pay you, so you're not dependent on trading your time for money. When your assets produce enough income to cover your expenses, you're free from the wheel. That's real wealth." Robert pictured it, a life where the rent from a property, dividends from investments, or profits from a business flowed in, covering the costs of living. Work could be a choice, not a necessity. The thought felt both liberating and distant, like a mountain peak visible on the horizon. But Rich Dad wasn't finished. He pulled a napkin toward him and began sketching. On it, he drew a simple diagram, a person at the top, money flowing in from a paycheck, then immediately flowing out to expenses, rent, food, bills, and loans. Nothing stayed. Then he drew another diagram, where money from a paycheck first flowed into assets, investments, properties, small ventures. And from those assets, a new flow of income returned to the person, covering expenses and even growing beyond them. "This," he said, pointing to the second diagram, "is the escape." But most people never make the shift because they're too busy running in the first one. For the rest of the morning, they talked about examples, people who had left the rat race not by earning more in their jobs, but by using their earnings differently. One woman bought a small vending machine route, which slowly grew into dozens of machines around the city. A man started with one rental apartment and over the years used its profits to buy more. Neither had glamorous beginnings, but both had stepped off the wheel. As they spoke, Robert began to notice a subtle difference in the way Rich Dad talked about time. In the rat race, time was always being traded for money. 1 hour of work for 1 unit of pay. Outside of it, time became a lever. Work you did once, setting up an asset, making an investment, could continue to pay you over and over without requiring you to be there. This, Robert realized, was the real wealth, not just money, but time that was truly yours. Still, the path was not without its challenges. Rich Dad warned that escaping the rat race required discipline. The discipline to resist lifestyle inflation when income rose, the patience to let assets grow, and the courage to take calculated risks when others clung to safety. Most people, he said, get a raise and immediately raise their expenses. The rich get a raise and buy more assets. Over the following weeks, Robert began to observe the rat race everywhere. At school, teachers spoke of preparing students for good jobs, not for building assets. In his neighborhood, adults often complained about bills while planning their next big purchase. The wheel spun quietly, endlessly. One evening, Robert shared the concept with his real father. The man listened thoughtfully, but smiled in a way that suggested a difference in worldview. It's not a race if you enjoy the work, he said, and not everyone needs to be rich. Robert respected the sentiment, but he couldn't shake the image of the wheel and the knowledge that, for many, enjoyment faded when circumstances changed, when layoffs came, when health declined, or when retirement approached with too little saved. Rich Dad's voice echoed in his mind. Freedom isn't about quitting work. It's about having the choice. That night, as he lay in bed, Robert thought about the cage and the wheel. He didn't yet know exactly how he'd escape it, but he knew this: he wouldn't spend his life running in place. And that decision, he realized, was the first step out. The next lesson would dig even deeper into the invisible forces that keep people in the race, even when they can see the way out. The twin forces of fear and desire. The afternoon was warm, the kind of Hawaiian heat that lingered in the air like a slow exhale. Robert and Mike sat on a low stone wall outside Rich Dad's office. The traffic moved lazily. People strolled past with shopping bags, and somewhere nearby, the faint rhythm of ukulele strings floated in the breeze. Rich Dad stepped outside and joined them, his face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he leaned against the wall and watched the street in silence, as though waiting for the right moment. Finally, he said, The rat race isn't just a habit, it's an emotional trap. People stay in it not because they can't leave, but because fear and desire pull them back in every time they try. Robert frowned. Fear, I understand. People don't want to lose their jobs or their money. But desire, isn't that what makes people work harder? Rich Dad's eyes narrowed in a kind of patient amusement. Desire is a double-edged sword, Robert. It can push you to grow, but it can also blind you. Fear and desire together, that's the perfect prison. He paused, as though choosing his words carefully. Fear shows up the moment you think about doing something different, investing, starting a business, leaving a steady job. It whispers that you'll lose everything, that you're not ready, that you'll end up broke. And desire whispers that if you just had a little more, you'd finally be happy. A little more income, a bigger house, a better car, but it never stops. So fear keeps you clinging to the safe path, and desire keeps you spending whatever you earn. Between the two, you're trapped. Robert thought about his real father, who often spoke about the need for stability, for security. It was always about a good, dependable job and a pension. And he thought about neighbors who seemed to spend every extra dollar the moment they earned it. Maybe they were two sides of the same coin. Rich Dad looked toward the street, watching a man in a suit hurry past. That man, he said quietly, might be making 10 times what you'll make in your first job, but if he's spending 11 times what he makes, he's more trapped than you are. Mike tilted his head. So how do you break free? You train your mind, Rich Dad replied. You learn to see fear for what it is, a signal to prepare, not a command to stop. And you learn to control desire, to use it as fuel for building assets instead of feeding the cycle of spending. Most people run from fear and give in to desire without question. The rich do the opposite. They face fear and they master desire. He told them about his early years when he'd taken risks that made his friends shake their heads. There had been nights when he couldn't sleep, worried about losing money. Days when deals went wrong, when the numbers didn't work out. But each time, he learned something about the market, about himself, about how to adapt. Fear doesn't disappear, he said, but when you act in spite of it, you become stronger. Desire, on the other hand, was trickier. The world is always selling you something, he said, not just products, but ideas about what your life should look like. A bigger home means you've made it. A new car means success. Vacations, gadgets, clothes, they promise happiness, but they only give you a moment's thrill. Then you're back to wanting more. If you can't step back and see the game, you'll keep playing it until your last breath. Robert felt a quiet unease. He recognized in himself the small thrill of wanting something new, a better bike, a new pair of shoes, even just the shiny lure of coins in his pocket. It wasn't that these things were bad, but he could see now how easily they could grow into chains. Here's the secret, Rich Dad said, lowering his voice as though sharing something rare. When you feel fear, don't run. Study it. Ask what's really at risk and prepare for it. When you feel desire, pause. Ask if this thing you want will put money in your pocket or take it out. If it takes it out, think twice. He explained how mastering these two forces was the foundation of financial freedom. It wasn't about denying yourself all pleasures or avoiding all risks. It was about making sure neither emotion made the decisions for you. To illustrate, he told them the story of a young man who had inherited a small sum of money. Overcome by desire, he bought a flashy car and expensive clothes. Within a year, the money was gone, and he was back to working long hours to pay off debts. Another young woman had faced the same temptation, but instead used her inheritance to buy a small food stand. It wasn't glamorous, but it earned steady profits. Over time, she expanded into multiple locations. 10 years later, she could buy any car she wanted. But by then, she no longer cared about impressing anyone. The difference, Rich Dad said, wasn't luck. It was who controlled the emotions in the moment of decision. As the shadows grew longer, Robert realized something that made him oddly restless. Escaping the rat race wasn't just about money or even knowledge. It was about self-mastery, the quiet strength to say no when desire flared, and to say yes when fear whispered you couldn't. The sound of the ukulele drifted back again, mingling with the soft hum of the evening. Rich Dad looked at both boys, his gaze steady. "The sooner you learn this," he said, "the sooner you'll stop living by the rules of fear and desire. And that," he added, "is when you start to live free." Robert didn't yet know how he would master those forces, but he knew one thing he wanted to. Because now, the thought of living his life bound to them felt no different than running in that wheel forever. And as he walked home under the fading light, he realized the next lesson would be about seeing opportunities, the kind that often hide in plain sight, invisible to those still trapped in the race. The morning after their talk about fear and desire, Robert woke early. The air was still cool, and the first threads of sunlight stretched across the horizon. He could hear the distant caw of seabirds and the faint hum of fishing boats making their way out to sea. His mind was still turning over Rich Dad's words, as if they had lodged themselves in some hidden corner of his thoughts. When Robert arrived at Rich Dad's store later that day, the man was already at work, flipping through a stack of papers on his desk. He didn't look up immediately, but when he did, there was a small, knowing smile on his face. "You've been thinking," Rich Dad said, not as a question, but as a statement. Robert nodded. "About the wheel, about fear and desire." "Good," Rich Dad replied, "because now we can talk about the next step, seeing what others miss." He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. Most people walk through life with their eyes open, but their vision closed. They see only what they expect to see: jobs, bills, paychecks, prices. Opportunities pass right in front of them, but they don't recognize them. Why? Because they've been trained to look for security, not possibility. Robert tilted his head. Like what kind of opportunities? Rich Dad reached into a drawer and pulled out a crumpled flyer. It was an advertisement for a small shop space for rent. The price was low, almost suspiciously so. "I saw this in the paper this morning," he said. "Most people would look at it and think, I'm not looking for a store. I don't have the time. I don't know anything about running one." And they'd move on. But someone with an investor's eye might think, could I rent this space, start something small, and sublease part of it? Could I turn it into something that earns money while I'm not here? Robert studied the flyer, trying to imagine what Rich Dad meant. "Opportunity," Rich Dad continued, "is often dressed in work clothes. It looks like a problem, or like something that will take effort. Most people want opportunities to look like winning lottery tickets. But the real ones, the ones that change your life, they usually require you to think differently and act when others hesitate." They spent the afternoon walking through the neighborhood. Rich Dad pointed out little details Robert had never noticed before. A vacant lot next to a busy street, a rundown building across from a school, a small business that always had a line out the door. "See that lot?" Rich Dad asked, nodding toward the empty space choked with weeds. "Most people see an eyesore. I see land in a prime location. Someone will come along, clean it up, and turn it into something valuable. The question is, will it be you? Or will you walk past it 100 times like everyone else?" Robert began to realize that this was a different way of moving through the world. One where you weren't just a passerby, but a quiet observer, constantly asking questions. Who owns this? Why is it like this? Could it be used differently? Later, they stopped in front of an old house with peeling paint and a sagging porch. "This," Rich Dad said, "was once bought by a man who saw what others missed. The owner at the time was desperate to sell. Everyone else thought it was a money pit. But this man saw the structure was solid and the land was in a growing neighborhood. He bought it cheap, fixed it slowly, and rented it out. That rent paid for the repairs, and eventually he sold it for 10 times what he paid. People called him lucky. But luck, he said, is just preparation meeting opportunity." The words hung in the air. Robert thought of all the places he'd walked past without a second glance. Stores, houses, empty lots, and wondered how many had been invisible opportunities. Rich Dad's voice softened as they walked on. "This is why mastering fear and desire is so important. Fear will make you see risk where opportunity exists. Desire will make you chase shiny distractions instead of real possibilities. But if you can quiet both, you'll notice what others overlook." By the time they returned to the store, the sun was dipping low. Rich Dad handed Robert a small notebook. "Carry this with you. Write down anything you notice. A place, a business idea, a conversation you overhear. At first, it will feel pointless. But over time, you'll train your mind to spot patterns, to connect dots. That's when opportunities start appearing everywhere." Robert opened the first page and stared at the blank space. It seemed like such a small thing, a notebook, but he felt a flicker of anticipation. That night, as he lay in bed, the notebook sat on his desk. He could hear the crickets outside, their song steady in the darkness. He thought about the lot with the weeds, the old house with the sagging porch, the tiny shop space from the flyer. They were just pieces of the world, but maybe, with the right eyes, they were something more. He didn't yet know how he would act on such opportunities, but now, the thought of walking through life without noticing them felt almost like a kind of blindness, and he had no intention of keeping his eyes closed again. The next lesson would reveal another piece of the puzzle: how money, when handled the right way, can be made to work for you, quietly and steadily, even while you sleep. The afternoon sun slanted in through the wide windows of Rich Dad's office, casting a warm glow across the wooden desk. Dust motes drifted lazily in the golden light, moving like tiny dancers in the still air. Robert sat across from Rich Dad, notebook in hand, the pages already filled with small scribbles from the past few days. Rich Dad leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. We've talked about the rat race. We've talked about fear, desire, and seeing what others miss. But today, he said, his voice steady and deliberate, we're going to talk about one of the most important shifts you'll ever make: understanding how money can work for you. Robert gave a small smile. I've heard you say that before, but I still don't really understand what it means. That's because most people are trained to believe the opposite, Rich Dad replied. They're told they have to work for money. They're told their time is what earns them a paycheck. But here's the thing: if you only ever work for money, you'll always be limited. You can't add more hours to the day, and you can't work forever. The wealthy understand something different. Money itself can be put to work, like an employee, and it will work without rest. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a simple brass coin. He set it on the desk and spun it gently so that it whirled, catching the light. This coin, he said, could be spent today on something you'll forget by next week, or it could be invested, and it will start bringing back more coins, which will bring more coins, and so on. That is money working for you. Robert thought of his allowance and how quickly it seemed to vanish. Ice cream, comic books, a small toy, little things that felt good in the moment, but were gone almost instantly. Let me tell you a story, Rich Dad continued. When I was about your age, I saved up enough money to buy a small set of used comic books. Instead of reading them once and leaving them on a shelf, I built a little comic book library in a friend's garage. I charged kids a small fee to read all they wanted for 2 hours. The comics worked for me. They kept bringing in money, even when I wasn't there. I didn't have to keep earning the money over and over with my time. Robert's eyes widened. So you didn't have to work the whole time to make it? Exactly, Rich Dad said. That's the difference. When you work for money, your income stops the moment you stop working. When money works for you, the income keeps coming, whether you're on vacation, asleep, or sick in bed. He stood and walked over to a large chart pinned to the wall. On it were two columns. One was labeled earned income, and the other was labeled passive income. Earned income, he explained, is the money you work for: wages, salaries, tips. It's tied directly to your effort. Passive income is the money your assets earn for you: rental income, dividends from stocks, profits from a business you own, but don't run every day. The key to wealth is to shift from earning with your back to earning with your brain, and eventually with your assets. Robert studied the chart. It was so simple in design, yet it felt like it was opening a door in his mind. The middle class and poor, Rich Dad said, spend their lives relying almost entirely on earned income. That's why they're always busy, always stressed about time and bills. The wealthy focus on building sources of passive income, and the moment their passive income exceeds their expenses, they're free. He let the word free hang in the air for a moment. Robert imagined it, not having to worry about working to survive, because the money was coming in regardless. It was a strange thought, and yet it made perfect sense. But remember, Rich Dad said, money won't work for you if you keep spending it the moment it arrives. That's where most people fail. They have an extra $100 and think about what they can buy, not what they can build. He walked back to his desk, picked up the brass coin, and flipped it once into the air. It landed with a soft clink. Every dollar you earn is like a seed. You can eat it today, or you can plant it and grow a tree that bears fruit for the rest of your life. The more seeds you plant, the more trees you'll have, and the more fruit you can pick without ever having to plant again. Robert scribbled the phrase, "Every dollar is a seed," in his notebook, underlining it twice. To start, Rich Dad said, you don't need a fortune. You just need the habit of putting some of your money into assets, things that make you money, before you spend on anything else. Over time, that habit will build more wealth than most people ever see. He gave Robert a small challenge. From now on, every time you get paid, whether it's an allowance, a gift, or earnings from work, set aside at least 30% for investments before you spend a single cent. Pretend it doesn't exist for spending. That's your seed money. As they wrapped up for the day, Rich Dad looked at him with quiet seriousness. The sooner you understand this, the sooner you can step off that wheel. Most people spend their lives running faster and faster, never realizing that they could have built something that runs for them. The thought stayed with Robert on the walk home. He passed shops and houses, imagining each as an asset, something that could quietly earn income without someone having to be there every moment. It was like discovering a hidden world, one that had been there all along, but invisible to him until now. That night, as the crickets sang outside, Robert stared at the notebook on his desk. Inside, he drew a small seed and a tree beside it. Beneath, he wrote, "Plant now, harvest forever." He didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of a lifelong habit, one that would slowly, quietly change the course of his life. And soon, Rich Dad would reveal another truth. Before money can work for you, you have to understand what kind of assets to build and what traps to avoid. The afternoon was warm, with a slow ocean breeze carrying the faint scent of salt and sun-warmed wood. Robert sat at the wooden table in Rich Dad's back office, his notebook open and pen in hand. He could hear the soft ticking of the old wall clock, a sound that seemed to mark each moment of his education. Rich Dad walked in holding 2 mugs of tea. He set one in front of Robert before lowering himself into the chair opposite. His movements were slow, unhurried, like a man who had long since stopped rushing. "You've learned," he began, "that money can work for you. But before you can put it to work, you need to know where to put it. That's where most people fail, not because they don't earn enough, but because they don't understand the difference between an asset and a liability." Robert had heard the words before: asset, liability, but they'd always been wrapped in the kind of language adults used when talking about banks and businesses. Rich Dad smiled knowingly. Most people think they know. They'll say an asset is something you own and a liability is something you owe. But in the real world, it's simpler and far more important than that. An asset is something that puts money in your pocket. A liability is something that takes money out. That's it. He reached into his desk and pulled out 2 slips of paper. On one, he wrote, "Puts money in." On the other, "Takes money out." He placed them side by side on the table. "Now," he said, "let's test your thinking. Is your house an asset?" Robert thought for a moment. "Yes, you own it, so it's an asset." Rich Dad shook his head gently. "If you live in it, it's most likely a liability. It costs you money every month: mortgage payments, taxes, maintenance. Unless it's bringing in more money than it costs, it's not an asset." Most people fall into this trap. They think owning a big house makes them rich, when in reality, it often keeps them trapped. He leaned forward, tapping the "puts money in" slip. An asset feeds you. It works for you. Rental properties, stocks that pay dividends, a business you don't have to run day to day. These are assets. They add to your income. Liabilities, on the other hand, feed on you. Cars, houses you live in, credit card debt. They take money from you every month. Robert scribbled the definition in his notebook, underlining it twice. "I'll tell you a story," Rich Dad continued, "about a man I once knew. He earned a good salary and bought himself a large, beautiful home. Every month, the mortgage took nearly half his paycheck. He filled the house with expensive furniture and 2 luxury cars in the driveway. People thought he was wealthy, but his bank account told another story. He had no investments, no assets, just big bills. The moment he lost his job, everything crumbled. That's the danger of mistaking liabilities for assets." Robert frowned. "So, it's not just about how much you earn, but how much you keep and where you put it." "Exactly," Rich Dad said, smiling. "I know people who earn very little, but are truly wealthy because they own assets that produce income. And I know people who earn millions yet are broke the moment the paychecks stop. He stood and went to the chalkboard on the far wall. In a few swift strokes, he drew two simple diagrams. The first showed money coming in from a job and flowing straight out into expenses: rent, car payments, bills. The second showed money coming in from assets, small streams flowing together into a larger pool, while expenses remained the same or even smaller. "This is the game," he said, pointing to the second diagram. "Fill your life with assets until they cover all your expenses. Then you can work because you want to, not because you have to." Robert leaned closer, his mind already racing. "So if I start buying assets now, even small ones, over time, they can grow enough to cover everything?" "Yes," Rich Dad said, "but it requires discipline. The temptation will always be to buy liabilities because they look impressive. A shiny car, a bigger house, the latest gadgets. These are what the world tells you to buy when you earn more. But assets often look boring at first. A rental property in a quiet neighborhood, a modest stock investment, a small business you rarely visit. Yet these boring things are what quietly build freedom." He returned to the table and sipped his tea. "Think of it like planting trees. Liabilities are like cutting flowers. They're beautiful for a moment, then they fade. Assets are like planting fruit trees. They take time to grow, but they'll feed you for life." Robert sat back, letting the analogy sink in. He thought about the small bit of money he had saved and how much of it he had wasted on things that didn't last. "From now on," Rich Dad said, "before you buy anything, ask yourself one question. Will this put money in my pocket or take it out? If it takes money out, think very carefully. Sometimes you'll still buy it. Life is for living, after all. But you'll do it with awareness. And you'll always make sure your assets grow faster than your liabilities." The lesson seemed almost too simple, yet Robert could feel its weight. It wasn't about earning more first, then learning. It was about learning now, so that when he earned more, he would know what to do with it. As the afternoon sun began to fade, Rich Dad looked out the window. The world is full of people who look rich, but are one paycheck away from trouble. And it's full of people who seem ordinary, but have quietly built fortunes. The difference isn't luck, it's knowing the game you're playing. That night, Robert lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. In his mind, he imagined two invisible lists, one for assets, one for liabilities. He pictured each dollar he earned standing at a crossroads, choosing one path or the other. From this day on, he promised himself, he would guide as many as possible toward the asset path. He didn't yet know it, but this promise would change the course of his future. And soon, Rich Dad would show him the next step: how to develop the kind of mind that not only builds assets, but sees them where others see nothing at all. The morning light filtered through the slats of the old wooden blinds, striping Rich Dad's office in gold and shadow. Robert sat in the familiar leather chair, feeling the quiet weight of the space, the smell of paper and ink, the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. It was here that ideas seemed to take on a physical shape, like the dust motes drifting in the sunbeams. Rich Dad entered without hurry, carrying a stack of books under one arm. He placed them gently on the desk, then looked at Robert with a slight smile. Today, we step away from numbers and charts. Today, we talk about something far more important, the mind that controls them. Robert tilted his head. The mind. Yes, Rich Dad said, pulling out his chair and sitting across from him. Wealth doesn't start in the bank. It starts in here. He tapped his temple with 2 fingers. You can give a poor man $1 million, and within years, sometimes months, it will be gone. You can take all the money from a wealthy man, and he will find a way to earn it back. That's because true wealth is not the money itself. It's the way you think. Robert's pen was already poised above the notebook. Most people, Rich Dad continued, are taught to think like employees. Their thoughts revolve around security, not opportunity. They ask, how can I keep my job? Rather than, how can I create something bigger than myself? And because of that, their world remains small. Their choices are limited by fear. He leaned back, the chair creaking softly. The wealthy, on the other hand, train their minds to see possibilities where others see walls. They ask better questions. Instead of saying, I can't afford it, they ask, how can I afford it? That shift opens doors in the mind, and those doors often lead to rooms filled with opportunity. Robert wrote the question down, circling it. How can I afford it? Rich Dad stood and went to the bookshelf. He selected a worn, leather-bound volume and set it before Robert. The cover was faded, but the gold lettering still caught the light. This, he said, was given to me by a mentor when I was younger than you. It's not a book about money. It's about thinking. It taught me to challenge assumptions, to see the unseen, to question the obvious. Without that, I would never have recognized the opportunities that made me wealthy. Robert opened the book to a random page. There was a single sentence written in bold. Your world is only as large as your mind allows it to be. That, Rich Dad said, pointing at the line, is why mindset matters more than money. The poor often say, the rich get richer because they have more money. But the truth is, the rich get richer because they have more ideas. Money follows ideas, not the other way around. He moved to the chalkboard and began sketching a simple diagram, a small circle labeled comfort zone, surrounded by a much larger circle labeled opportunity. Most people live here, he said, tapping the small circle. They do what they've always done, think how they've always thought, but the wealthy live here. He tapped the larger circle. They're willing to step into uncertainty. They're willing to try, to fail, and to learn. Robert thought about it. So the difference is they take more risks. Not exactly, Rich Dad said. They take calculated risks. They educate themselves. They prepare. They look for ways to protect themselves. but they still move forward. The poor often avoid risk entirely, thinking that's safer, but in truth, avoiding all risk is the most dangerous thing you can do. It leaves you dependent on others for your security. He walked back to the desk and poured 2 glasses of water from a pitcher. The mindset of the wealthy is also shaped by one more thing. They believe they are responsible for their own lives. They don't wait for someone to save them. They don't blame the government, the economy, or luck. They see themselves as the driver, not the passenger. Robert took the glass, sipping slowly. He could feel the truth of the words and also their weight. When you take full responsibility, Rich Dad said, you stop waiting for permission. You stop hoping for luck. You start looking for ways to shape your own future. That's when opportunities begin to reveal themselves. He paused, letting the words settle. But it's not easy. The moment you start thinking differently, you'll face resistance. Friends may say you've changed. Family may warn you to be careful. Society will pull you back toward the safe, familiar path. That's why you must guard your mindset like a treasure. Surround yourself with people who think big. Read books that challenge you. Learn skills that open doors. Robert wrote furiously, but every so often he'd glance up, catching the intensity in Rich Dad's gaze. I'll give you an example, Rich Dad said. When I started my first business, I had nothing but an idea and the willingness to learn. People told me it was too risky. They said I should stick to a safe job. If I had listened, I'd still be working for someone else. Instead, I treated each mistake as tuition, the price I paid for learning. Over time, those lessons built the foundation of my fortune. He smiled faintly. Remember this, failure is only the opposite of success if you stop trying. To the wealthy, failure is just part of the journey. Each mistake is a stepping stone. The poor avoid mistakes. The wealthy mine them for gold. The clock ticked softly in the background. Robert could feel the lesson becoming something more than just words. It was seeping into the way he saw the world. Rich Dad's voice softened. The mindset of the wealthy is not about greed. It's about freedom. It's about having choices, about building a life that is not controlled by fear or dependency. Money is simply the tool they use to achieve that freedom, but without the right mindset, even the biggest fortune will slip through your fingers. As the sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the room, Rich Dad leaned forward and placed a hand on Robert's notebook. Grow your mind first. The assets will follow. If you chase money without growing your thinking, you'll never keep it. But if you grow your thinking, money will chase you. Robert nodded slowly. He understood now why Rich Dad had waited to teach this. Numbers could be learned in a day, but changing the way a person thought, that was the work of a lifetime. That night, as Robert walked home under the fading light, the street seemed different. The houses, the shops, even the people, all of it felt like a puzzle he had just begun to understand, and he knew that the next lesson would take him deeper still. Into the realm of opportunities most people never notice. The rain had been falling since before dawn, soft and unhurried, washing the dust from the streets and painting the world in shades of silver. Robert walked toward Rich Dad's office with his coat collar turned up, the sound of his footsteps mingling with the steady patter of raindrops on the pavement. There was something about rainy days that made the world feel slower, quieter, as if time itself had curled up somewhere to rest. When he entered the office, Rich Dad was standing by the window, watching the rain trickle down the glass. He didn't turn at first. "Do you know why I like days like this?" he asked after a moment. Robert shook his head. "Because rain makes most people stay inside. It makes them cancel plans, delay errands, put things off. But opportunities," Rich Dad said, finally turning, "do not wait for good weather. The world belongs to those who are willing to step outside, while others hide indoors." Robert took a seat, setting his damp notebook on the desk. Rich Dad reached for a folded map and spread it across the table. It was the layout of the neighborhood streets, alleys, blocks of buildings. "Opportunities are everywhere," he said, tapping the map with a finger. "But most people don't see them because they've been trained to look for the obvious: a job opening, a sale, a winning lottery ticket. The real opportunities are quiet, almost invisible, and they're often disguised as problems." He pointed to a shaded block near the river. "This area floods every few years. People avoid buying property here. They think it's trouble, but someone who looks deeper might ask, is there a way to use this land differently? Could it be turned into storage units raised above flood level? Could it be a seasonal business that only operates in dry months? Or could the low prices make it worth reinforcing the property and selling later at a profit?" Robert leaned closer, tracing the streets with his eyes. Rich Dad continued, "Every obstacle is a doorway, but only if you're willing to turn the handle. Most people walk right past. They see risk, inconvenience, or hard work, and they move on. The wealthy pause, study, and ask questions. Often, they're not competing with a crowd, because there is no crowd." He told Robert about a man he once knew who made a fortune buying old vending machines. They were scratched, dusty, and half broken, sitting in the back rooms of businesses. No one wanted them. But this man repaired them, placed them in strategic locations, and within a year, they were producing a steady income. "People saw junk," Rich Dad said. "He saw little gold mines on metal legs." They spent the afternoon walking through the rain, visiting parts of the town Robert rarely explored. In a narrow alley, Rich Dad stopped in front of a boarded-up shop with peeling paint. "What do you see here?" he asked. Robert shrugged. "An empty store. Looks like it's been closed for years." "Exactly," Rich Dad said. "But look again. It's next to a busy cafe. Every morning, this street is filled with foot traffic. The cafe doesn't sell baked goods, only coffee. What if someone opened a small bakery here? Or a print shop offering services to the office workers nearby? This isn't just an empty shop. It's a waiting opportunity." Robert began to see what rich dad meant. The boarded windows weren't signs of failure, they were blank canvases. As they walked on, Rich Dad spoke of the mental habits that allow people to notice these hidden chances. First, you must stay curious. Ask why things are the way they are. Why is that building empty? Why is that business always busy? Second, you must be patient. Sometimes an opportunity needs time to ripen. Third, you must prepare, learn the skills, gather the resources, so that when you find the right door, you can walk through it. They stopped at the corner of two busy streets, watching the flow of cars and pedestrians. Rich Dad gestured to the scene. To most people, this is just traffic. To someone trained to see opportunity, it's a study in movement and need. Where are they going? What do they buy along the way? What is missing from their journey that could make their lives easier? By the time they returned to the office, Robert's mind was buzzing. He realized that opportunities weren't rare jewels hidden deep underground. They were scattered everywhere, lying in plain sight, but they were invisible to those who had never learned how to look. Rich Dad poured them both tea and sat across from him. The truth is, Robert, there's never a shortage of opportunities. There's only a shortage of people who recognize them. And those who do often seem lucky to the rest of the world. But it's not luck, it's training, it's awareness. He leaned forward, his voice softer now. And here's the most important part. When you begin to see opportunities others miss, you'll also begin to see yourself differently. You'll stop waiting for someone to give you permission. You'll stop thinking the game is rigged. You'll realize you can create your own path. That's when life begins to feel limitless. Robert sipped his tea, feeling the warmth spread through him. The rain had slowed outside, and through the window, he could see a pale beam of sunlight breaking through the clouds. It struck him that perhaps opportunity was like that, sometimes hidden behind a gray sky, waiting for someone willing to stand outside long enough to see it. That night, as he sat at his desk, Robert opened his notebook and began a new list, not of things to do, but of things to notice. He wrote down the boarded-up shop, the flooded river property, the old vending machines. They weren't plans yet. They were seeds. And perhaps, in time, they would grow into something more. What he didn't yet know was that the next lesson would be even more subtle, not just about seeing opportunities, but about creating them when none seemed to exist. The morning after the rain, the air carried that fresh, clean scent that only comes after a storm. A mixture of wet earth, washed leaves, and the faint tang of the sea drifting in from the harbor. Robert made his way to Rich Dad's home rather than the office this time. He had been invited for breakfast, though he suspected it was not only breakfast he would be receiving. Rich Dad's house stood at the end of a long, tree-lined street. The old wooden shutters were thrown open to the morning sun, and from inside came the soft clink of dishes. Robert was greeted not by Rich Dad himself, but by the aroma of fresh bread and coffee. When he entered the kitchen, Rich Dad was already at the table, slicing thick pieces of bread and spreading them with butter. "Eat first," he said, sliding a plate toward Robert. "Lessons are better received on a full stomach." They ate in companionable silence for a while. Outside, the street bustled with the slow stirrings of the day. A milkman's cart, the chatter of two women carrying baskets, the distant call of a fisherman selling his morning catch. After breakfast, Rich Dad poured a second cup of coffee and leaned back in his chair. "Yesterday, we spoke about recognizing opportunities others miss. That's a valuable skill, but sometimes there simply are no opportunities to be found, at least not in the obvious sense. And that's when the real magic begins, because the truly wealthy don't just wait for opportunities. They create them." Robert's brow furrowed. "Create them from nothing." Rich Dad smiled faintly. "From thin air, as they say. But it's never really nothing. It's about weaving together threads that others leave lying about, threads no one else thinks to connect." He stood and motioned for Robert to follow him into the study. There, on the wall, hung a framed map of the island from many years ago. It was yellowed with age, the ink faded in places. Rich Dad traced a finger along the coastline. "When I was your age, this area here was nothing more than marshland. No one wanted it. The government didn't know what to do with it. But I imagined something different, a place where tourists could come to see the birds and the wildflowers, a place with boardwalks and small shops." Robert listened as Rich Dad described how he had spoken to local authorities, persuaded them to lease the land cheaply, and then invited local craftsmen to set up small stalls. Within 2 years, the marshland became a thriving market. The government collected rent. The craftsmen had steady customers, and I took a percentage of each stall's earnings for organizing it. There was no opportunity here, Robert, until I built one. Robert nodded slowly. "So, you look for unused things, unused land, unused ideas." "That's one way," Rich Dad said. "But it's also about unused connections. Two things that seem unrelated, when brought together, can create something entirely new. For example, years ago, I noticed that a small printing shop was struggling. At the same time, a nearby school wanted to publish a yearbook, but couldn't find a printer who would do it cheaply. I introduced the two, helped negotiate terms, and for my trouble, I received a small percentage of the deal. The printer got more business, the school got its yearbooks, and I got a new income stream, all because I put together two pieces that no one else thought to join." They sat at the large oak desk, and Rich Dad took a blank sheet of paper. "When you cannot find opportunity, make a list. Write down resources you have access to, not just money, but skills, knowledge, relationships, unused spaces, underused equipment. Then think, how could these be combined in a way that solves a problem or creates value?" He wrote as he spoke. Empty warehouse plus artists needing studio space equals shared art center. Robert leaned forward. "So you don't always need to own the resource yourself." "Exactly," Rich Dad said. "Ownership is not always the goal, control is. You can create opportunities using other people's resources if you know how to make it worth their while. And here is the deeper truth. Most people have resources they don't even realize are valuable. Your job is to see them, then show others the value they've been overlooking. He told Robert of a time when he organized a community fair using land borrowed from a friend, tents rented from another contact, and local farmers who were eager to sell produce. He risked very little of his own money, but walked away with a healthy profit, all because he saw the possibility of combining these scattered pieces. Robert began to see the pattern. It's like you're a bridge, he said. You connect things, people, resources, ideas, and the bridge itself becomes valuable. Exactly, Rich Dad said, his eyes brightening. And here's something else. Creating opportunity is not just about making money. It's about building a habit of seeing potential where others see nothing. Once you master that, you become unstoppable. The economy can collapse, industries can fade, but you will always find a way forward because you've trained yourself to build from scratch. The conversation drifted into quieter reflection. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, spilling through the windows and painting the study in warm light. Robert thought about the many times in his own life when he had walked past something simply because it didn't look useful at first glance. Now he wondered how many of those moments could have been turned into something if he had only known how to look differently. Rich Dad sipped his coffee and said, almost as an afterthought, when others complain about what's missing, ask yourself, how could I provide it? That question alone has built fortunes. Robert closed his notebook slowly, as if sealing the lesson inside. The idea of creating something from nothing felt both daunting and exhilarating, like learning you could conjure a flame from your bare hands if only you knew the trick. And he suspected that the next lesson would take him further still, into the realm of protecting what you build, for opportunities, once created, can vanish just as quickly if you are not careful. The wind had shifted overnight, carrying the scent of the ocean deep inland. It was one of those mornings when the horizon seemed unusually sharp, as if the world had been washed clean. Robert found himself walking along the coastal road toward Rich Dad's office, thinking not just about opportunities, how to find them, how to create them, but what came after. Because he had begun to notice a troubling truth in his reading and in the stories of others. He saw a pattern. Fortunes made, fortunes lost. Brilliant ideas crushed by a sudden downturn. Promising ventures collapsing under the weight of mismanagement. It seemed that building wealth was only half the battle. The other half was keeping it alive. Rich Dad was already at his desk when Robert arrived, surrounded by ledgers and documents. He looked up with a small smile. You're early. I've been thinking, Robert said, taking a seat. You've taught me how to see opportunities and even create them when none seem to exist. But I've seen people lose everything. How do you make sure what you build lasts? Rich Dad leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Ah," he said softly, "now you are asking the right question. Building wealth is like planting a garden. You must plant the seeds, yes, but then you must protect them from pests, from drought, from careless feet trampling the soil. Otherwise, the harvest never comes." He stood and walked over to a cabinet, retrieving an old, leather-bound journal. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, diagrams, and notes in the margins. "This belonged to my mentor," Rich Dad said. "Everything he built, he protected. He used to say, 'A man who cannot keep what he earns is like a fisherman who lets the net slip from his hands.'" Robert listened as Rich Dad outlined the first principle, separation of assets. "Never keep all your wealth in one form or in one place," he said. "If a storm sinks your fishing boat, you still want to own a vineyard inland. If one crop fails, another can sustain you." He told Robert about a merchant who invested all his profits into a single shipping venture. For years, it paid well, until one terrible season, when storms destroyed half the fleet. The merchant was ruined because he had tied his future to a single rope. And when that rope broke, there was nothing left to hold onto. The second principle was legal and structural protection. Rich Dad explained how wealthy individuals often placed their assets in trusts, companies, or partnerships to shield them from lawsuits, taxes, or sudden claims. "This is not trickery," he said. "It is simply building a fortress around what you own. A wise man doesn't just have treasure, he has walls to guard it." The third principle was reinvestment for growth. "Money that sits still grows weaker," Rich Dad said. "Inflation eats at it. Opportunity passes it by. Some of what you earn must be put to work, always, like a farmer who plants part of his harvest to ensure next season's crops." He told Robert about an investor who bought a small apartment building. Instead of spending the rent money on luxuries, the investor saved it to buy another building, and then another. Within 20 years, Rich Dad said, he had a chain of properties that supported him for life, but he never stopped maintaining them, never stopped looking for ways to improve their value. Growth is not just about adding, it is about strengthening what you already have. Robert took notes, his pen scratching across the page. The lesson was not simply about keeping money safe. It was about making it resilient. Rich Dad poured 2 cups of tea, handing one to Robert. The steam curled in the morning light. "There is another danger," he said, his tone shifting. "It is not storms or thieves. It is yourself. Pride, greed, impatience. These have destroyed more fortunes than war or famine. You must be your own watchman. When you taste success, it is tempting to believe the river will never run dry. That is when men take the greatest risks, often without realizing it." Robert thought of the stories he'd heard, traders who had doubled their wealth, and then gambled it all on a single speculation, only to lose everything. Farmers who borrowed heavily in good years, and then could not repay in the bad. "So," Robert said slowly, "protecting assets is not just about legal structures or diversification. It's also about discipline. Yes, Rich Dad said, smiling faintly. Discipline is the lock on the vault. Without it, even the strongest walls will crumble from within. They walked later along the harbor, watching the fishing boats return with their morning catch. Rich Dad pointed to one vessel, smaller, less flashy than the others. That one belongs to a man I've known for years. He never competes to have the biggest boat, but his nets are always mended, his crew loyal, his debts minimal. In storms, he survives while others sink. He is not chasing size, he is building stability. And stability, he said, is the soil in which long-term wealth grows. By the time they returned to the office, Robert felt the weight of the lesson settle into him. Opportunities could make you rich, but protection and growth would make you stay rich. It was a quieter kind of skill, less glamorous than the thrill of a new venture, but perhaps even more important. As the afternoon sun began to fade, Rich Dad closed the old leather journal and slid it back into the cabinet. You are learning quickly, Robert, he said. But remember this, protecting wealth is not a one-time act. It is a habit, a constant watch. Neglect it, and it will slip through your fingers like sand. Robert nodded, feeling both the responsibility and the possibility of what he had learned. What he did not know was that the next lesson would test him in an entirely different way. For it was not about guarding against loss, but about navigating the unpredictable currents of change itself. The first winds of change often arrive quietly, without thunder or fanfare. Sometimes they come as a new machine in a shop window, a strange foreign word in the marketplace, or a rumor whispered in the corner of a crowded tavern. And yet, by the time most men notice the change, it has already swept over them like a tide, leaving only the quick-footed and sharp-eyed standing. Robert was beginning to sense this truth. It was late autumn, the air crisp with the faint bite of approaching winter. Leaves rattled along the streets in little spirals, and the harbor seemed quieter than usual. As he approached Rich Dad's office, he saw him standing outside, hands in his coat pockets, watching a group of men unload crates from a truck. The crates were stamped with words Robert had never seen before, strange lettering, elegant and precise. What's that? Robert asked. New goods from overseas, Rich Dad replied, his voice thoughtful. Not long ago, no one here had heard of them. Now, merchants are ordering them by the dozens. That, he added, is change knocking at the door. Inside the office, the stove burned steadily, casting a warm glow. Rich Dad gestured for Robert to sit. We've spoken about building wealth and protecting it, but there is another skill that separates those who keep their fortunes from those who lose them: adaptation. He poured tea, the sound of it delicate against the silence. The world, he said, does not stay still for you. Markets shift, technology advances, governments change laws, and people's desires, those change faster than anything. If you cling to the way things were, you will find yourself stranded in a place that no longer exists. Robert nodded, though the words felt heavy. So it's not enough to have good investments. Rich Dad shook his head. No, good investments in the wrong time are no longer good. A man who owned the finest stable of horses at the dawn of the automobile age was rich one year, ruined the next, unless he found a way to adapt. He leaned forward. There are signs, Robert, always. You must learn to see them before others do. A new machine that works faster than 100 men. A shift in the way people spend their money. A government favoring one industry over another. These are not random, they are signals. He told a story from his youth. When I was still learning, there was a man in the city who owned a thriving candle-making business. He employed dozens, sold across the region. Then the electric light arrived. He dismissed it at first, a curiosity for the wealthy. But within 10 years, his customers had vanished. He could have adapted, turned his factory to making electric fixtures, perhaps, but he clung to the past. His business, his wealth, his legacy gone. Robert could almost see the man, sitting in a dim office surrounded by unsold candles, the walls closing in. So, Robert asked, how do you prepare for changes you can't predict? You cannot predict every change, Rich Dad admitted, but you can make yourself ready to pivot. That means never tying your entire future to one way of doing things. It means keeping your knowledge fresh, your contacts broad, and your mind open. It means watching, always watching, for the small tremors that come before the earthquake. Rich Dad rose, pacing slowly. When I hear of a new invention, I don't ask if it threatens my business. I ask how it could help me, or how I might profit from it. When I see a new law being discussed, I don't complain. I think about which doors it might open. He stopped by the window, gazing out at the harbor. Most people resist change because it is uncomfortable. But wealth, Robert, does not care about your comfort. It flows to those who move with the current, not those who stand on the bank shouting at the water. They talked until the afternoon sun began to turn the sky gold. Robert felt both challenged and strangely inspired. The idea of change had always seemed like a threat, something that could take away what you had worked for. But Rich Dad was painting it as a tool, even an opportunity. Before Robert left, Rich Dad said something that would stay with him for years. When the wind changes, you can curse it, or you can adjust your sails. But only one of those choices will carry you forward. That evening, as Robert walked home through the quiet streets, he passed a shop selling radios, a new device just starting to appear in people's homes. He noticed how a small crowd had gathered at the window, listening to the faint, tinny voice coming from inside. And for the first time, he didn't see a gadget. He saw a signal that the world, once again, was moving. And soon, Rich Dad would teach him the final pieces of the puzzle, lessons not just about money, but about the life it could create and the freedom it could grant. If a man was wise enough to hold on to it. The air in Rich Dad's office was still that morning, save for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Outside, the sky was pale and cloudless, the kind of quiet day when time seems to slow, and the mind is free to wander into deeper thoughts. Robert entered carrying his notebook, expecting a lesson about markets or investments. But Rich Dad was at the window, looking not at the harbor, but beyond it, as if his gaze stretched across decades rather than miles. "You've learned," he said without turning, "how to earn wealth, how to grow it, and how to protect it. But tell me, Robert, what happens to your wealth when you're gone?" Robert paused, caught off guard. "I suppose it would go to my family." Rich Dad nodded. "Perhaps, but will it remain? Will it grow? Or will it be scattered, spent, and forgotten within a generation?" He turned and fixed Robert with a steady look. "You see, boy, most fortunes vanish within 2 generations. The first builds it. The second enjoys it. The third doesn't even remember where it came from." Robert frowned. "Why?" Rich Dad poured 2 cups of tea before answering. "Because wealth without wisdom is like a tree without roots. It may stand for a while, but the first strong wind will topple it." He set a cup before Robert and sat down. "The greatest legacy a man can leave is not gold, nor land, nor businesses. It is the knowledge, habits, and values that protect and multiply those things. If you pass on money, but not understanding, you have given a banquet to a man who does not know how to cook. When the meal is gone, he will go hungry." Robert thought about the merchants he had seen in the city, families who had once been powerful, now reduced to small shops or even begging in the streets, their fine houses sold, their businesses gone. And he remembered, too, the rare families whose names still carried weight after a century. He wondered what separated them. Rich Dad began to tell him, "It begins with education, not the schooling of classrooms, but the education of life. Teach your heirs not just how to spend money, but how to make it, how to protect it, how to make it grow. Involve them early. Let them make small mistakes while the cost is small, so they do not make great mistakes when the cost is ruin." He leaned back, his eyes distant. "My mentor once made me manage a small market stall for a season. It was worth almost nothing, but it taught me to bargain, to read people, to keep accounts. He said, 'If you can protect a penny, you can protect a pound.'" Then came the second principle: structure your wealth for longevity. Do not simply hand over assets. Place them in trusts, in well-managed enterprises, in ventures that reward stewardship and punish carelessness. Build systems that make the wealth work for them, instead of letting them work against it. Robert listened, scribbling notes, as Rich Dad described families who had done this, creating foundations, partnerships, or inheritance rules that prevented quick, foolish sales of land or businesses. Some had lasted for centuries, their fortunes not only intact, but thriving. The third principle was more personal: pass on your values. If your children believe wealth is only for comfort, it will die with them. If they believe it is a tool for building, for creating, for contributing, it will live on. The richest legacies are not measured in coins, but in character. Rich Dad's voice softened. When you are gone, Robert, your gold cannot speak for you. Your deeds, your lessons, your example, these will be the voice they hear. He told of a shipbuilder he had known, a man of great skill and discipline. When he died, he left his shipyard to his children. But more than that, he left them his journals, filled with notes on craft, trade, and life. Those journals became their guide, and the shipyard thrived for another 50 years under their care. Robert imagined such a legacy, not just buildings and accounts, but words, wisdom, a living thread connecting generations. It stirred something deep within him. By afternoon, Rich Dad rose and walked to the old cabinet where he kept his mentor's leather-bound journal. He took it out, turned it over in his hands, and then set it gently on the table before Robert. "This is not yours to keep," he said, "but I want you to read it. In these pages is the map of a life well built. My mentor is long gone, but his mind, his principles, they live on in these words. That is the true meaning of wealth that outlives you." Robert traced the worn leather cover with his fingers, feeling the weight of it, not in pounds, but in significance. When he finally left that evening, the sun was low, painting the streets in a warm, fading gold. He realized that the path he was on was not merely about becoming rich. It was about becoming a link in a chain, one that, if he was wise, would remain unbroken long after his own hands could no longer hold it. But before that future could be secured, Rich Dad still had more to teach, lessons about freedom, responsibility, and the final test of all, knowing when enough is truly enough. The harbor was alive that morning. Ships were docking, their hulls heavy with goods from distant lands. The air was a mix of salt, tar, and the faint sweetness of exotic spices. Robert made his way to Rich Dad's office, weaving through sailors shouting in strange accents and merchants haggling over crates. He found Rich Dad outside, not watching the bustle, but the horizon. His gaze lingered there, as if measuring distances not in miles, but in years. "You've been learning how to earn, grow, and protect money," Rich Dad began, without turning. "But all of it, is for one purpose, freedom." Robert frowned slightly. "Freedom? You mean being able to buy whatever I want?" Rich Dad smiled, the kind of smile that carries both amusement and pity. "No, Robert, that is the freedom they sell in shop windows, the freedom of trinkets and indulgence. I am speaking of the kind of freedom kings envy." They went inside, where the kettle was already steaming. Rich Dad poured tea, his movements unhurried. "Freedom," he continued, "is the power to live by your own design, rather than another man's demands. It is the ability to choose how you spend your days, whom you serve, and what you create. And most of all, it is the power to say no without fear." He sat across from Robert. Most men wake to the sound of a clock that does not belong to them. They work hours chosen by others, for purposes decided by others, in exchange for pay that barely lets them rest before they must do it again. That is not freedom, no matter how much they spend on their comforts. Robert thought about the shop clerks, the dock workers, even some merchants he knew. Their time seemed owned by someone else, even if they had gold in their purses. But how does money buy freedom? He asked. Rich Dad leaned forward. Because wealth, true wealth, gives you choices. It allows you to step away from those who would command you. It lets you refuse a dishonest partner, turn down an unfair deal, or walk away from a city that no longer suits you. Without wealth, you must accept what is given. With it, you can choose. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. But be careful. Many men earn money only to bind themselves tighter. Buying bigger houses they must work longer to keep. Acquiring luxuries that require more servants, more upkeep, more worry. They think they have bought freedom, but they have only gilded their cage. Robert nodded slowly, sensing a deeper truth. So the point is to have enough and not need more. Rich Dad's eyes softened, enough to sustain the life you want without being chained to it. Enough so that your time, the most precious coin you will ever own, belongs to you. He told Robert a story from his early years in trade. I knew a merchant who earned a fortune in his youth. Instead of chasing more, he invested wisely, set aside a modest but steady income, and then he traveled. He read. He learned new languages. He mentored young traders when others burned themselves out trying to double their fortunes. He lived as he pleased because he knew what enough looked like. Robert could picture the man, perhaps sitting on a shaded veranda in some warm, distant port, sipping tea while ships came and went, unhurried and unconcerned with the fever of the market. Rich Dad's voice grew thoughtful. The danger is that the world will always tell you you need more. More gold, more land, more ships. If you do not decide for yourself what is enough, the pursuit will consume your life. And then, when you finally stop, you will realize you traded all your days for numbers on a page. Robert felt a chill, not from the air, but from the image the words painted. He wondered if perhaps he too might one day be tempted by just a little more. Rich Dad seemed to read his thoughts. Freedom is not just bought with money, Robert. It is kept with discipline. It means guarding your time, your mind, and your energy as fiercely as you guard your gold. The afternoon light was fading when Robert left, but the words stayed with him as he walked the quiet streets home. He thought about the dock workers who would still be laboring long after he had reached his bed. He thought about the merchants with fine houses but weary faces. He thought about the horizon Rich Dad had been staring at that morning. Freedom, he realized, was not about what you could buy. It was about what you no longer had to sell: your hours, your energy, your life. And perhaps, just perhaps, he was beginning to understand why Rich Dad had spent so many years teaching him, one lesson at a time. But the road was not yet complete. For the next lesson would be about the responsibility that comes with such freedom. and how, in the wrong hands, it can turn into ruin. The rain had been steady all morning, not the wild, lashing rain of a storm, but the patient, unhurried kind that seeps into the earth and lingers in the air. The streets glistened under a pale light, and the sound of water dripping from tiled roofs followed Robert as he made his way to Rich Dad's home. Inside, the fire was already lit. Rich Dad sat near it, a book open in his lap. He closed it slowly when Robert entered, marking the page with a strip of worn leather. "You've been thinking about freedom," he said without preamble. Robert smiled faintly. "Yes, and about how rare it is." Rich Dad nodded. "Rare and fragile. Freedom without responsibility is like a ship without a keel. It may float for a time, but the first real wind will tip it over." He gestured for Robert to sit. "Let me tell you a truth most men avoid. The more wealth you hold, the more lives you touch. And the more lives you touch, the greater your duty becomes. Gold does not free you from responsibility. It multiplies it." Robert tilted his head. "But isn't the point of wealth to live without obligations?" Rich Dad's eyes sharpened. "That is the fantasy of the selfish. A man with means has influence, whether he seeks it or not. His decisions ripple outward, affecting employees, families, communities. A careless choice with money can ruin livelihoods, just as a wise one can create them." He reached for a ledger on the table and flipped it open. Inside were neat columns, not of profits, but of people, names, trades, and notes. "These," Rich Dad said, "are the men and women my ventures touch. The sailors who crew my ships, the carpenters who repair my warehouses, the merchants who depend on my goods. If I act in haste or gamble recklessly, I do not risk only my own fortune. I risk their bread, their roofs, their children's schooling." Robert looked at the list, understanding dawning. This was not just business. It was a web of human lives, tied together by invisible threads. Rich Dad continued, "Many rich men believe they owe nothing to anyone. They say, 'I earned this. It is mine to do with as I please.' And perhaps they are right in law, but in life, in the fabric of human connection, they are deeply wrong. Wealth is a tool, and tools can build or destroy. The choice is ours, but so is the responsibility for the outcome." He leaned back, his gaze on the fire. "When my mentor gave me my first investment stake, he told me, 'Every coin you hold is a seed. You may plant it to grow food, or you may grind it to dust. But remember, others may have to eat from what you grow, or starve from what you waste.'" Robert sat quietly, picturing the coins as seeds in the earth. It was a different way of thinking about money, not as something static, but as something alive, capable of multiplying into abundance or vanishing into nothing. The lesson deepened when Rich Dad shared a story from his early trading days. He once had the chance to buy an entire shipment of rare timber at a price so low it could have doubled his profit in a single month. But to do so, he would have had to cancel his existing contracts with smaller suppliers, leaving them with unsold stock and no income. "I could have taken the deal," he said. "Many advised me to, but I didn't." Those smaller suppliers had families. They had stood by me when I was starting out. If I had abandoned them for short-term gain, I might have been richer that year, but poorer in trust forever. Robert saw the weight of such a decision, the invisible cost that does not appear in ledgers, but is measured in loyalty and respect. "That timber deal," Rich Dad said with a faint smile, "went to another merchant. He made his profit. But when his fortunes turned, he found no friends to help him. My suppliers, on the other hand, became lifelong partners. Some of them still trade with me today. That is the wealth of responsibility. It returns to you in ways you cannot predict." The rain had quieted outside, and a silver light crept across the room. Rich Dad's voice softened. "One day, Robert, you will hold the power to change the course of many lives. You may be tempted to see your fortune as a fortress, something to hide within, safe from the needs of others. But a true fortress is built not from stone, but from the goodwill and trust of people. And that is earned only by shouldering the responsibilities your wealth brings." Robert nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the words. He realized that freedom, without this understanding, could turn a man into something cold and disconnected, a king without a kingdom. As he left, the streets were still damp, the air cool and fresh. He thought about the names in that ledger and how they represented real faces, real lives. The idea of wealth as mere personal gain now seemed shallow, almost childish. He was beginning to understand that the richest men were not those with the largest vaults, but those whose prosperity was woven so deeply into the lives of others that their fortune could not be pulled apart without tearing the fabric of a community. And yet, Rich Dad had hinted that the journey was nearing its end, that there was one final lesson before the story of Rich Dad and Poor Dad would be complete. It would be about balance, the art of knowing when to pursue more and when to simply live. It was late summer when Robert received the invitation. The air was warm, but not heavy, the kind of evening when the sea breeze carries the faint scent of flowers from distant gardens. Rich Dad had asked him to meet at a small villa on the outskirts of town, a place Robert had never been before. When he arrived, he found the villa perched on a quiet hillside, with terraces overlooking the bay. Below, ships swayed gently at anchor, their masts like slender brushstrokes against the fading sky. Rich Dad was in the garden, tending to a patch of herbs. He greeted Robert with a smile that carried no urgency, just the contentment of a man who had mastered his own pace. "Do you know why I brought you here?" he asked. Robert shook his head. "This," Rich Dad said, gesturing to the garden, "is my final lesson to you. All that we have spoken of, earning, investing, protecting, giving, it leads here to balance, a life in which wealth is neither your master nor your only pursuit." They walked slowly among the neat rows of plants. Rich Dad plucked a sprig of rosemary, crushing it lightly between his fingers, so the fragrance rose into the evening air. Most men, he continued, spend their lives leaning too far in one direction. Some chase wealth endlessly, thinking the next coin will finally bring peace. Others reject wealth entirely, convincing themselves it is a corrupting force. Both live in imbalance. True wisdom is found between the two, knowing when to strive and when to simply be. Robert thought about the merchants in town who never left their counting rooms, even when their fortunes were already secure. He also thought about old friends who avoided money matters entirely, only to find themselves dependent on others. The danger, Rich Dad said, is forgetting why you sought wealth in the first place. If you do not set boundaries, money will consume your thoughts, your hours, even your relationships. And if you fear it or ignore it, you surrender control over your life to those who do not. They reached a stone bench beneath a fig tree. Rich Dad sat, motioning for Robert to join him. The sun was dipping lower now, gilding the water with streaks of copper. I once knew a trader who worked himself into the grave before he was 50. Rich Dad said quietly. He told me he was doing it for his family. But by the time he had enough, his children were grown, and his wife no longer knew the man he had become. He had mastered the art of gaining wealth, but he never learned the art of living with it. Robert felt a knot in his stomach, the idea of reaching the end of the road, only to realize the road had been the wrong one, was sobering. That, Rich Dad said, is why you must learn the balance. When you are young, you must lean toward striving, building skills, taking risks, seizing opportunities. But as your wealth grows, the scale must tip toward preservation, generosity, and presence. At some point, the hours you guard for yourself will be worth more than any gold you could earn in them. He paused, then smiled faintly. And here is a truth that many find hard to accept. Sometimes, the right decision is to stop, to resist the lure of one more deal, one more expansion, one more fortune, to say, this is enough, and turn your efforts toward living. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the wind in the fig leaves. The distant sound of a ship's bell drifted up from the bay. Finally, Robert asked, "How do you know when you've reached that point? When to stop chasing?" Rich Dad looked out toward the horizon. When the pursuit of more no longer excites you, but merely occupies you. When the thought of another coin in the vault feels less satisfying than an hour spent in peace. When the life you could live today is already richer than the one you keep postponing for tomorrow. Robert took in the words, feeling their quiet weight. Rich Dad stood and walked toward the terrace, where the view opened fully to the bay. The sky was now deepening into purple, and lanterns on the ships flickered to life one by one. "This," he said softly, "is balance. I still trade, but not every day. I still earn, but I do not chase. I give where I can without crippling my own household. I tend my garden as carefully as I tend my accounts." I spend time with people I value, and I guard my solitude when I need it. My wealth supports my life. My life does not serve my wealth. Robert felt something settle in him, a sense that all the lessons, all the years, had been guiding him toward this quiet truth. As they stood together in the gathering dusk, Rich Dad placed a hand on his shoulder. One day, you will teach this to someone else. And when you do, remember, they will not understand it fully until they have walked the long road you are still on. But if you plant the seed now, it will grow when they are ready. They returned inside, where the table was set for a simple meal: bread, olives, cheese, and a decanter of wine. No lavish banquet, no servants bustling about, just two people sharing what the earth and sea had provided. Robert understood then that wealth was not measured by the extravagance of the table, but by the peace with which one sat at it. And though there would be one final conversation between them, he felt that tonight, under the fig tree and beside the quiet bay, he had been given the heart of Rich Dad's wisdom. The end was near, and with it, the passing of a torch. The morning was clear, with that crisp kind of light that makes the edges of every object sharper, as though the world itself has been polished overnight. Robert woke early, drawn by a quiet anticipation he could not quite name. Rich Dad had sent for him, saying simply, "It is time." When Robert arrived, he found the old man in his study, surrounded not by gold or ledgers, but by books, histories, maps, and journals worn thin from years of turning pages. Sunlight poured in through the tall windows, catching in the dust motes that danced lazily in the air. Rich Dad looked up and smiled. "You've walked with me a long way, Robert. Today, I give you something that is not coin, not land, not even a business. I give you the torch." He reached into the drawer of his desk and drew out a leather-bound ledger. Robert recognized it immediately, the one that held the names of the people whose lives Rich Dad's ventures touched. "This," Rich Dad said, handing it over, "is yours now. The businesses, the ships, the warehouses, all are run well enough. But this is the true record of wealth. These are the people you must remember with every choice you make." Robert held the book carefully, almost reverently. The leather was warm from Rich Dad's hands. "Why give this to me?" he asked quietly. Rich Dad's eyes softened. "Because wealth without continuity is wasted. I have taught you how to earn, how to protect, how to grow, how to give, and how to balance. But now you must learn how to carry it forward, and how to pass it on again when your time comes." He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the town below. "When I was your age, my own mentor gave me nothing but a few coins and a warning. Do not let your fortune die with you. I have lived by that. My greatest pride is not in what I have built, but in knowing that it will live beyond me in capable hands." Robert joined him at the window. Ships moved in the harbor, the tide drawing them gently toward the open sea. He thought of the years ahead, of the responsibility that would now rest on him. "It feels heavy," he admitted. Rich Dad nodded. It should. That weight will keep you steady when the winds rise. But remember, you are not carrying it alone. Every person in that ledger is part of the journey. When you care for them, they will care for the work, and the work will care for you. They sat at the table, and Rich Dad began to speak, not as a teacher now, but as a man leaving instructions to a trusted heir. He spoke of which partnerships could be relied on, which ones needed watching. He shared the histories of certain deals, the ones that had nearly failed, the ones that had unexpectedly saved the business. He described, in quiet detail, the values that must never be compromised, no matter how tempting the gain. And then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "When you pass this torch, pass it to someone who has not only skill, but heart. Skill without heart will build for a time, but it will never endure." The hours passed like minutes. Outside, the day warmed, and the scent of the sea carried through the open windows. At last, Rich Dad closed his eyes for a moment, as though he were listening to something far away. "You know," he said slowly, "this is the first time in years I feel I can truly rest, not because my work is done. Work is never done. But because I know the road will be walked by someone who understands where it leads." Robert felt a lump in his throat. He realized then that this was not only the end of his apprenticeship, but the beginning of his own chapter. The man who had shaped his mind, his values, his very understanding of what it meant to live well, was stepping back. They rose, and Rich Dad placed both hands on Robert's shoulders. "From this day forward, you are not the student. You are the steward. Guard the wealth not for your sake alone, but for all who depend on it. And when your hair turns silver, as mine has, be ready to pass the torch again." Robert nodded, unable to find words. They walked together to the door. The sunlight outside was warm now, spilling across the cobbled street. People moved about their morning tasks, shopkeepers arranging goods, children carrying baskets, sailors hauling ropes. Life went on, as it always did. And yet, for Robert, the world felt subtly altered. He was no longer merely observing the current. He was part of guiding it. Rich Dad lingered in the doorway, watching him go. "Remember, Robert," he called after him, "a fortune is not measured in what you keep, but in what you leave behind." Robert carried the ledger under his arm as he walked away, feeling the pulse of life around him, the laughter of children, the calls of merchants, the rhythm of hammers in the shipyard. Each sound was a reminder of the people whose names were now his to protect. As he reached the edge of the harbor, he stopped to watch a ship set sail. Its sails caught the wind, and slowly it moved toward the horizon. He thought of Rich Dad's torch and of his own responsibility to keep its flame alive, not by guarding it in the dark, but by carrying it forward so that others might see by its light. The tide was turning. A new voyage had begun. And so, my friend, the long journey of Rich Dad and Poor Dad comes to a close, not with the clink of gold or the signing of a final contract, but with the quiet passing of a torch, the kind of torch that lights paths for generations yet to come. If you've listened this far, you've walked alongside Robert through the narrow streets, the bustling markets, the tense moments of decision, and the still evenings of reflection. You've heard the lessons whispered between deals, and you've felt the weight of choices that stretch far beyond a single lifetime. Now, as you lie there in the soft comfort of night, I invite you to let these lessons settle in your mind like the last embers of a warm fire. Think of what wealth means to you, not only in coins or notes, but in moments of peace, in kindness given, in the strength you can offer to others. If your eyelids are heavy, let them close now. Imagine yourself walking the harbor at dusk, the water glowing with the last light of day, the sails of distant ships slowly fading into the horizon. The air is calm. The world is steady. You are exactly where you need to be. Before you drift away into rest, I would love to know, from where in the world are you listening tonight? What time is it there? Is it the stillness of midnight or the gentle quiet just before dawn? Leave your answer in the comments below. I read everyone, and it warms my heart to see our little community scattered across the globe, connected by stories like this. If you wish for more journeys like this, stories that carry you through history, business, and the deeper meaning of life, you can stay close by simply subscribing. And if tonight's tale brought you peace, consider leaving a like so others may find it too. But for now, let the tide carry you toward rest. The ships will still be there tomorrow. The streets will still hum with life, and the torch will still burn for those ready to take it. Sleep well, my friend. Until the next story, good night.